A rich woman forces a black waiter to play the piano just to mock him, and to her surprise, he is super talented. What unfolds next will leave you shocked. As Evelyn sat with her elite friends, she became bored and then got the ugly idea of using the black waiter for sport to entertain her racist friends. So she called out, "James!" Her sharp voice sliced through the chatter, silencing the room. Her painted lips curled into a condescending smile. "Do you ever grow tired of mediocrity? Carrying trays for people you'll never be?" James paused mid-step, the tray steady in his hands. His dark eyes flicked to hers, unreadable, yet steady. Evelyn leaned back against her chair, her diamonds catching the light as she gestured lazily toward the grand piano. "I wonder," she mused, her tone dripping with mockery. "Can you do more than balance glasses? Perhaps you've got a hidden talent. Can you play, or is that asking too much of someone like you?" A ripple of laughter spread through the room, the cruel kind that lingers too long, the exact effect she was hoping for. But she would find out soon enough that talent is not measured by the quality of one's clothes, the color of their skin, or the kind of job they do. As James set his tray down with deliberate care, he straightened to his full height. "I've played a few times," he replied, his voice measured, calm. Evelyn arched a brow, delighted. "Really? A waiter with aspirations?" She clapped her hands, each smack echoing her mock enthusiasm. "Let's give him a chance, shall we? Show us what those talented hands can do." The crowd erupted in encouragement, a mix of jest and derision. James held her gaze, his jaw tightening briefly before he gave a single nod. "If that's what you'd like," he said coolly. He strode toward the piano, every step deliberate, his face betraying nothing. Evelyn smirked, sure of the humiliation to follow. The room buzzed, eager to witness his failure. But his failure never came. Before we get into this heartwarming story, I'd like to give a shout out to this subscriber, Gracie. If you would like a shout out in my next story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Also, if you enjoy these types of heartfelt stories about justice, kindness, and equality, hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next story when it drops. Now, let us get into it. James stood motionless for a moment, his calm demeanor unshaken despite the growing pressure in the room. Evelyn, reclining in her chair with her signature smug smile, gestured dramatically toward the grand piano at the center of the room. "Well," she drawled, her voice dripping with mockery, "let's not keep everyone waiting. Show us your skills." The crowd chuckled, their laughter laced with anticipation. Conversations quieted as they turned their full attention to James. Their eyes gleamed with amusement, expecting the night's entertainment to come at his expense. A waiter stepped forward and gently guided James toward the piano. Each step seemed heavier than the last, the distance feeling far greater than it truly was. The soft hum of the previous background music had faded, replaced by the quiet murmur of onlookers whispering to one another. As James reached the piano, Evelyn leaned forward, a wicked glint in her eye. "Don't hold back now," she said, her words cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Show us what you got." The gathered crowd closed in slightly, eager to watch the performance unfold. James's hand hovered over the polished surface of the piano, his expression calm, betraying none of the emotions Evelyn was hoping to provoke. For a moment, the room held its collective breath, waiting for the inevitable stumble, the mistake that would feed their laughter. Evelyn's smirk widened, certain she had created a spectacle to remember. James sat down at the grand piano, his movements deliberate and calm. His back was straight, his hands resting lightly on the keys, as if he'd done this 100 times before. The room, once alive with mocking whispers, fell into an uneasy silence. Without a word, James began to play. The first notes drifted into the air, a soft, haunting melody that wrapped itself around the crowd. The gentle rhythm was both delicate and powerful, silencing even the faintest murmurs. Evelyn's smirk faltered slightly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass. She leaned forward, her confidence beginning to waver. James's hands moved with precision and grace, his fingers gliding effortlessly across the keys. As the melody evolved into a complex, emotionally charged piece, the room seemed to hold its breath. Each note resonated, drawing gasps from the onlookers. "He's remarkable," someone whispered, breaking the spell only briefly. Evelyn's expression darkened, Her once confident smile had vanished, replaced by a growing frown. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes narrowing as she watched James perform. The music swelled, rich with emotion, as James poured his heart into the piano. The depth of his talent was undeniable, each chord weaving a story far beyond the shallow expectations of the audience. When James transitioned into a breathtaking crescendo, the crowd was utterly captivated. Some leaned forward, enraptured. Others exchanged wide-eyed glances, as if questioning how they had underestimated the man before them. Evelyn for once found herself at a loss for words. As James played on, the applause in the room grew louder with every intricate flourish. Evelyn's frown deepened. She gripped the edge of her chair, her earlier amusement now twisted into irritation. How could a waiter, a black nobody, command the attention she craved at her own event? She rose from her seat abruptly, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor drawing attention. "Well," she said with a tight smile, her voice cutting through the music, "it seems you've practiced more than just balancing trays." James paused momentarily, his fingers resting on the keys. He glanced up at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "I like to be prepared," he replied smoothly. The crowd chuckled softly, the subtle jab not lost on anyone. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "Prepared," she repeated with a bitter laugh, stepping closer to the piano. "But this isn't exactly Carnegie Hall, is it? Perhaps we've all just had a bit too much champagne to judge fairly." The room grew tense, the earlier admiration now clouded by her thinly veiled insult. James, unshaken, smiled faintly and resumed playing, his fingers weaving a triumphant, bold melody that seemed to swell with defiance. "You're right, Ms. Sinclair," James said, without looking at her, his tone polite yet pointed. "This isn't Carnegie Hall, but I've been there, once, as a performer." Gasps rippled through the room. Evelyn froze, her expression stunned, her grip tightening on her glass. "And thank you for the opportunity to share my skills tonight," James continued, his eyes finally meeting hers. "It's rare to find a hostess who challenges her guests." Laughter erupted from the crowd, breaking the tension. Evelyn's face flushed as she turned sharply, retreating to her seat while James finished his piece to thunderous applause. As the applause finally began to die down, a guest seated near the piano leaned forward, his curiosity evident. "You're incredible," he said to James. "Where did you learn to play like that?" James hesitated, his hands still resting lightly on the keys. His composed demeanor wavered for just a moment, as though the question struck something deeper. Before he could respond, another voice cut in. It was Miles, a fellow waiter and James's longtime friend. He stepped forward, tray in hand, his tone casual but filled with admiration. "James doesn't talk about it much," Miles said, glancing around the room, "but he used to be a rising star in the classical music world." The room grew quieter, curiosity thick in the air. Evelyn's irritation deepened as she listened, unwilling to lose control of the narrative. "Rising star?" another guest asked, leaning in with interest. Miles nodded, a hint of pride in his voice. "He won competitions back in his youth. Judges called him a prodigy, but, you know." He paused, his expression dimming. "He's been waiting for his big break." The words hung heavily, and the scene seemed to blur as James's mind wandered to the past. Letters of rejection piled up, some subtly hinting at his fit for their institutions. A haunting memory lingered of him, overhearing a conversation about funding priorities and appropriate representation. A lot of opportunities that slipped away because he didn't fit in. James blinked, returning to the present. He looked up, his voice calm yet firm. "Life is not always fair, but humans sometimes don't make it any better." The room stayed silent, absorbing his words. Evelyn's knuckles whitened around her champagne glass as James finished his first piece to thunderous applause. The admiration from the crowd, the way they whispered his name with awe, it gnawed at her. This was her event, her spotlight. And yet here he was, a waiter, commanding attention. She forced a brittle smile and clapped a bit too loudly, silencing the room. "Well," she said, her voice tight, "that was quaint. But surely a true pianist wouldn't stop at just one piece." The crowd exchanged glances, sensing her tension. "How about something difficult, James?" Evelyn continued, her tone sharp with challenge. Something that shows us you really deserve all this applause." James paused, his calm expression unwavering. For a moment, he studied her, the faintest hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "As you wish, Ms. Evelyn," he said evenly, settling his hands back on the keys. The first note struck with precision, bold and fiery. The piece was unmistakably challenging, a classical composition layered with rapid arpeggios and dramatic crescendos. James's fingers moved effortlessly, commanding the piano as though it were an extension of himself. The music filled the room, rising and falling like a storm, each note igniting the air with passion and intensity. The audience was spellbound, some leaning forward in their seats, unable to look away. Evelyn's brittle smile cracked further, her attempt to regain control unraveling with every flawless note. As James reached the climax of the piece, the piano thundered under his touch, the final chords ringing with triumph. He lifted his hands slowly, the room erupting into a standing ovation. James met Evelyn's gaze briefly, his expression calm yet pointed. "I hope that was difficult enough," he said, his voice low but unmistakably firm. As the applause thundered through the room, a voice suddenly rang out from the back, cutting through the noise. "You're Carter! James Carter!" The crowd turned toward the speaker, a tall man with silver hair and an air of authority. Victor Laramie, the renowned composer whose name commanded respect in music circles, stepped forward with an incredulous expression. "I've seen you perform years ago," Victor continued, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and excitement. "You're brilliant. Absolutely brilliant." The room froze, the whispers starting almost immediately. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances, their surprise palpable. James Carter, the waiter, was not just talented. He was a name that even Victor Laramie recognized. Evelyn's face paled, though she quickly tried to mask her shock with an unconvincing laugh. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" she said, waving a hand dismissively. "What a small world." Victor ignored her entirely, his focus entirely on James. "Why on earth aren't you still performing?" he asked, his tone almost urgent. "Your interpretations of Chopin and Liszt were extraordinary. You were destined for greatness." James stood slowly, meeting Victor's gaze with quiet dignity. "Sometimes the path we plan isn't the one we end up walking," he said simply. The crowd murmured, their admiration for James growing by the second. Evelyn's brittle smile returned, though it was clear she was grasping for control. "Well, I suppose we've uncovered a hidden gem tonight," she said, forcing a laugh. "What a treat for my guests." Victor glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable, before turning back to James. "You deserve more than this," he said firmly, his words echoing in the hushed room. Evelyn looked away, her embarrassment deepening as James's understated brilliance eclipsed her entirely. Victor stepped closer to James, his admiration evident. "You know, I have a show in 2 weeks, a big one. I'd be honored if you joined the performance. The world deserves to hear you again." The room erupted into applause, guests cheering and nodding in agreement. James stood quietly for a moment, his expression thoughtful, before finally nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Laramie. That means a great deal to me." Victor clasped James's hand warmly, his respect for the man clear. The applause grew louder, some guests even rising to their feet. Evelyn, standing at the center of it all, felt the ground shift beneath her. Her carefully curated image, her dominance over the evening, was slipping away with every cheer. She forced a tight smile and raised her glass. "Well," she said, her voice laced with sarcasm, "it seems our dear waiter has stolen the show. Congratulations, James. Truly, what a remarkable twist this has been." The guests quieted, sensing the tension in her words. James turned to Evelyn, his calm gaze meeting hers. "Thank you, Ms. Evelyn," he said, his tone polite yet firm. "It's funny, isn't it? How talent doesn't care about privilege." The room went silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Evelyn's smile faltered, her cheeks flushing as the crowd exchanged knowing glances. Victor, sensing the shift, clapped James on the shoulder. "And that," he said with a grin, "is why he belongs on the stage, not serving drinks." The applause returned, louder than before, leaving Evelyn isolated in her embarrassment. James, composed and dignified, stepped away from the piano, now fully in control of the room, and the night. If you are proud of how James subtly stood up for himself without ruffling his feathers, hit the subscribe button to show your support for him. As the evening continued, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Guests who once flocked to Evelyn for her charm and influence now gravitated toward James. They gathered around him, eager to hear more about his story. Victor stood at James's side, praising his talent to anyone who would listen. "A man like this deserves respect," he declared loudly, glancing pointedly in Evelyn's direction. "Not condescension." Evelyn lingered at her table, her smile strained as she tried to maintain her usual air of control, but the whispers had already begun. "Did you see the way she treated him?" one guest murmured. "Awful," another replied. "She should be ashamed. She practically tried to humiliate him." The hushed voices weren't loud, but Evelyn could feel their sting. She pretended not to notice, sipping her champagne with forced grace, though her hand trembled slightly. Across the room, James remained composed, his quiet humility only endearing him further to the crowd. Guests who had once praised Evelyn now lined up to shake his hand and offer their admiration. Victor leaned in close to one group, his tone firm. "People like Evelyn think they can treat others however they want. Tonight, we saw where true class and talent lie." The comment spread quickly, fueling more quiet disdain toward Evelyn. Her once loyal admirers began to peel away, avoiding her gaze as they whispered behind their hands. By the end of the night, Evelyn sat alone at her table, her carefully curated image in tatters. The laughter and applause that filled the room were no longer hers to claim. James glanced at her briefly before leaving with Victor and the remaining guests, his quiet triumph leaving Evelyn in the shadows of her own event. If you also do not like when people are unjustly treated and misjudged because of the color of their skin or the quality of their clothes, hit the subscribe button right away to support this channel. Only people who like to unjustly misjudge others will not subscribe. Evelyn stormed into the small corridor where James stood alone, retrieving his coat. Her face was flushed with anger, her carefully composed mask finally shattered. "How dare you!" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You humiliated me. You stole my moment. This was my event, my night." James turned slowly to face her, his calm demeanor unshaken. For a moment he said nothing, letting the weight of her words linger. Then he spoke, his voice measured and steady. "Your moment?" he said softly, his gaze unwavering. "Evelyn, you asked me to play. I didn't steal anything." Evelyn flinched, her grip tightening on her shawl. "You thought this was about mocking me," James continued, his tone gaining quiet strength. "But all you did was reveal your own insecurity, your need to step on others to feel tall." She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand, silencing her. "People like you underestimate others because it makes you feel safe," James said. "But tonight, you learned that dignity and resilience will always outshine privilege. No amount of wealth can cover a shallow heart." Evelyn's face twisted in fury, but she had no response. James stepped closer, his voice now firm and final. "I don't need your approval, Evelyn. I never did. And after tonight, neither does anyone else here." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing in the empty corridor, her anger mingling with a deep, unavoidable shame. Do you think Evelyn deserved what she got? Or it served her right? As James stepped out of the mansion into the cool Dallas night, his posture straight and his head held high, the weight of the evening had lifted, replaced with a quiet sense of triumph. Beside him, Victor Laramie walked with an air of excitement, already discussing plans for James to perform at his upcoming show. "You'll be magnificent," Victor said, clapping James on the back. Tonight was only the beginning. Several other influential guests lingered near the grand entrance, offering their congratulations and exchanging contact information with James. "We'd love to sponsor your performance," one said eagerly. Another added, "You've got something rare, James. Don't let the world forget it again." James nodded graciously, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the flurry of opportunities being presented. Inside the mansion, the once lively party was fading into quiet murmurs. Evelyn sat alone at the head of the grand dining table, the clinking of staff clearing dishes echoing around her. Her carefully curated night had unraveled, leaving her humiliated in her own home. She sipped the last of her champagne, the taste bitter on her tongue. The once loyal guests who had flocked to her now spoke of James, their admiration for him growing with every retelling of the night's events. As the final guest trickled out, Evelyn's laughter and confidence seemed like distant memories. Outside, James glanced back briefly at the mansion before stepping into the night. The future awaited him, brighter than the gilded chandeliers he left behind. James stepped into his modest home, the familiar creak of the door welcoming him. The soft glow of a lamp illuminated the living room, where his mother sat waiting. Her face lit up with pride as she saw him, her warm smile saying everything words couldn't. "You did it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice full of emotion. James nodded, a faint smile on his lips. They listened. Without another word, he crossed the room to the old upright piano that had been his sanctuary for years. He sat down, his fingers grazing the worn keys, and began to play the same haunting melody that had silenced the grand crowd earlier that evening. The music filled the room, its rich tones resonating with triumph and quiet resilience. Let this story serve as a reminder. Never judge someone by the color of their skin or the clothes they wear. Everyone carries a story, and assumptions can blind us to their truth. What did you think of the story? Did it challenge your perspective? Join the conversation in the comments, and let's make a difference together. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Your support helps us share more stories that provoke thought and inspire change. Let's keep building a world where understanding triumphs over prejudice. In a world that often refuses to see, it's up to us to make them listen. The end.